The first thing you should do is download an ISO and create a bootable USB. If you're not able to do that, I assure you, you're not ready for Linux. Welcome back, Gadgeteers. So, for some reason, you guys really like my talking head videos, which I think are incredibly boring, but I'm going to go ahead and shoot one anyway. And I think you know the topic, the 5 reasons why you should not switch to Linux. And we're talking about the desktop here. We're not talking about servers. I think servers pretty much on Linux rule the world today. So I think that's pretty much over and done. So only the desktop. Now let's start with number 1. This one I want to get out of the way because it should be obvious, although it often is not obvious, and that is the gaming experience. So if you're a gamer and you really enjoy playing different video games, my recommendation is to stay on Windows because it can handle the most titles that are available out there. So if you're on Steam and you go to Steam and have a look at the titles, the OS that is supported is almost always Windows. So consider that. Linux does have support. They're getting better and better. There's a setting called Steam Play, or used to be called Proton, you can use in Steam and try to get games to work that don't normally work under Linux. I've had dubious experience. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So I don't know what to tell you with that. The other one is Lutris. I can't give you a good review of Lutris, but there are people out there that are doing it that say that it works really well and it'll support several different games, and it does it in several different ways, and it's supposed to set everything up for you automatically when you install the game and try to run it under Lutris. So I've had a little bit of experience running it, but I didn't have good success. Another thing you could do is GPU bypassing. So this gets really tricky for beginner users. I really don't see it as a possibility. Even Linux power users are going to be challenged. And basically what it means is to take a virtual machine of, say, Windows and run it on your system that is running Linux. And then what you'll do is pass the graphics processing unit, your graphics card, through to the virtual machine, so the virtual machine will have the capacity, the full capacity of the graphics card and abilities. It's a great idea, but then I think, why don't you just use Windows, because you're going to be using Windows, plus you have the complexity of setting it up. I understand people who want to do it because it's cool, you know, I mean, it's a lot of work, but it's really rewarding to be able to do that and have a Linux system with a virtualized Windows system that can see your graphics card and is able to run it at the game at full speed. I admit that is very, very cool. But if we're talking about for the novice or the average user of Windows, this isn't going to be something they're going to jump into when they're new with Linux, or even if they have some experience. So I'm going to go with no on that. I guess the bottom line is, why are you working so hard to fix something that isn't broken? You may want to have Linux on that system and it has Windows. Well, in that case, I would do a dual boot. And we'll talk more later about things you can do to run Linux, even if you're going to stick with Windows for a while. All right, number 2. This one's a big one in my opinion. The workflow change is huge. If you've been using Windows most of your life, and all of a sudden you're on Linux, it's not just the operating system, it's also all the applications make things fairly complicated. So a good example is I had Fifi log into my computer. That's all I wanted her to do. And she was able to do it, but it was actually somewhat difficult because it wasn't a Mac, which is what she's used to. And after that, she's somewhat used to Windows, but Linux, not so much. And you say, well, that's just a simple thing. Everybody should be able to do that. Well, they should, but think about the vast change in distributions of Linux. So the different versions of Linux that are available that different organizations make, and the desktop environments, which are the graphical interface that you look at. So most of the graphical interfaces are quite different than running a Mac or Windows. And you might say, yeah, well, you click the little thing on the left. That's usually how it works. Or in GNOME, you click on the right, to log out or whatever. Well, that assumes that you know that, and that's only one thing. What about all the other things? Applications. Did you fart?
Oh.
No, you stinky bastard.
Oh.
So applications are very different. That doesn't mean you can't get used to them, but you have to accept the fact that everything in, say, an Office application is literally in a different place. And when you look at Microsoft Office, like Word, and you look at LibreOffice, there's huge differences. So there's literally thousands of things you can do and change when you're in Microsoft Word, and it's completely changed in LibreOffice. That doesn't mean it can't be done. I'm just saying it's in different places. Some of us will get used to that faster than others. And again, I want to have a talk about that at the end of this video, so stay tuned. Okay. Number 3, because security is so bad in Windows, or it's so good in Linux. It's so good in Linux, you should switch to Linux. Well, what is the major claim to fame with Linux? Let's be honest. It's a couple of things. Security through obscurity. So it isn't very well known. It only holds a couple % of the overall desktop market out there. So it's not well known, and those who want to hack or gain access to systems say, well, why would I create something for 2% of the systems for more than likely a well-educated tech person? It just doesn't make any sense when I can create it for Windows 10, which is the most popular and has many novice users, so it should be an easier target. I grant that that probably is the case, but Windows 10 has progressed quite well with security. If you think of Windows XP and Windows 98 those days, it was almost impossible not to get a virus. And most of the people I talked with somehow ended up getting a virus. They didn't even know. They did what they thought was right. They had a firewall running. They installed antivirus software and so on and so forth. But today on Windows 10, if somebody was to tell me it's as bad as Windows XP, I would say no. Windows 10 is much better. And if you're really concerned about it, there's pretty simple guides like 8 steps to hardening Windows 10 or 6 steps to securing Windows 10 better. I looked at a couple of them last night. Will it really help? To some extent, yes, it will. And think of that as a possible way to secure Windows 10 more, but for the novice entry-level user, many of the functions that were an option back in Windows XP are now required, like Windows updates, depending on which version of Windows 10 you're using. Of course, there's many different versions. So I feel like you can't say Linux is more secure necessarily. It depends who we're talking about. If you throw a novice user on Linux, it may not be more secure depending on what applications they're using and what they're doing with the desktop. So we don't know. All right, that's number 3. Number 4, It's so much easier to install and run software on Linux. I don't buy this one at all. I hear many people say that, and there's some questions that I ask right away. Are you talking about the GUI installer or the command line? Many of them will say the command line because they're at least intermediate Linux users. Many of them will say, yeah, I use the GUI, but it messes up from time to time. I've had problems with the GUI. It is, in my opinion, very unreliable. And when I say GUI, I'm referring to the software application that is a part of the GNOME desktop environment. There's a similar application for KDE. If you have them both installed, the desktop environments, KDE and GNOME, KDE looking a little bit more like Windows, you find that you can use either of those apps, and they're not exactly reliable. It takes forever to populate the catalog with the GNOME app, when it's so much easier just to run a quick command and be able to do an update or install an application. But Windows users in general, and I'm not talking about the ones who use Windows as a profession, but those who are just using the operating system for home use, they don't really care for the command line. And I've had many comments on my videos where people have said, we don't want to see command line stuff. We want to see GUI stuff. So what I've been trying to do is integrate more use of the GUI, or at least try to use the GUI when I'm doing something like my previous video about Fedora 32 installation. I went ahead and tried to use the graphical interface. It didn't work out. Check out the video, and I ended up using the command line, which is recommended by Fedora Linux. So that's Fedora, maybe not the case for other distributions. The other thing you got to ask yourself is, well, which distribution are we using? Because there's different installation methods depending on the distribution you're using. And that in itself can make it more complicated, because you could be somebody that's coming from Ubuntu or some other version of Linux, and then you could say to yourself, well, go ahead and use DNF like I do. I'm on Fedora. And they install Ubuntu, which does not use DNF, and the command doesn't work. So they're already set back a few steps. Now they've got to figure out why it didn't work, and then go forward once they figure out the actual command to get it to work. And of course, even with Ubuntu, there's multiple ways you can install something, right? You can use the installer, you can use Flatpaks. There's all kinds of ways that you can do an install. The other thing I like to ask is, when you say an application is good and it didn't take long to install it, was it source code? If it was source code and you're expecting a Windows user to have to compile source code when you know full well that there are a multitude of error messages you most likely will get, and the fact is it can vary depending on distribution. You just can't guarantee with source code that somebody's not going to have a problem. So if somebody tells me you have to compile from source code, that's it. There's no way the end user who's used to Windows is going to be able to do that. So those are the issues that I think of when I come up with installing software on Linux. The other thing is, if you want to go through it, is updates. So I use the command line on Linux, so updates are very trivial for me. Some require a reboot, but you don't have to reboot immediately, so I reboot when I'm all done doing what I want to do. You get to choose when the reboot happens. With Windows, the updates are installed automatically. Now, at least more than before, you can choose an update time, as in when your computer is going to reboot, thankfully. So it's not as bad as it was before, but you do have to keep in mind when your system updates, it's going to finish the updates, which may take a little while even after you boot back up. So if you are running Windows and you do updates and you shut down, I recommend powering up, finishing the updates, and then shut down so you're ready to work right away the next time you power up the computer. I really think that the updates in Windows are easier. That isn't to say that they won't cause a problem, but in my opinion, they cause less problems than Linux updates. Depending on how much you change your Linux installation, in my opinion, really determines how many problems you're going to have. So if you're adding a lot of new packages, you're changing drivers for your video card, you're trying to get a game working and you install many packages, you could experience problems then or in the future. It just depends. So I guess the same can be said about Windows, but Windows and Microsoft have to support a huge number of clientele if you think about it. And there are problems, especially with their major updates. But with Linux, I see maybe a few more problems than that. But it's not just my experience. You can listen to other people on that because it really depends on the distribution and the desktop environment. With my desktop and my laptop, I've had really good success recently. So recently being the last 3 or 4 years, it's been quiet. There haven't been too many problems. Now, I recently did an update to Fedora 32 on my laptop, and it has a curious problem. When I power it up, it'll begin the Linux boot up, and the screen will go blank, and it just sits there. So I have to power it off. I can't do anything, not even a Control-Alt F2, F3 to get the command line to issue the shutdown. I can't even do that. I have to hold the power switch down for a few seconds, and then power it off, and then power it back on, and it's fine. Now, I have not done updates since I've installed Fedora 32, and it says there are 127 new updates, so I'm going to go ahead and do the updates, and I expect that that problem will go away. One of the problems, to me, with Windows is when they have a problem, it's big. I think they try to roll too much in to their big updates that they do, and it causes more problems. I think it's better to do updates regularly, but most of the updates are just security updates that are regular. Those big updates are OS changes. Okay. Number 5, because somebody told you to. I can convince a Windows user in less than 5 minutes that they should install Linux and it's going to be the best experience they've ever had. That doesn't mean that'll work that way. I've never done that. Okay, maybe one time. You shouldn't do that because if you're naive, you're a Linux installer or a Linux user and you're naive and somebody tells you about the problems they've had with Windows and you say, well, you need to go to Linux, man. You'll never have any of these problems anymore. That's not the case. Think of the steps or the issues 1 through 4 we just talked about. It's not something that a novice user is going to understand. Fortunately, when they install Linux, all the most used applications are already installed. But that doesn't mean that they're going to understand how to use those applications, set up Wi-Fi, get on the internet, what browser to use when they're used to a different browser. Yes, they can put Chrome on, but they have to learn how to put Chrome on, don't they? Depending on the distribution and so on. So even though you could convince somebody, Linux users, I'm talking to you, that your friend should install Linux and it'll be the best thing that's happened to them, I don't advise doing that. It just isn't something that is in their best interest, especially if they've been on Windows forever and a day. For those of you who have convinced Windows users to install Linux and blow away Windows, I think you know as much as I do that it usually ends poorly. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with Linux. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that a Windows user is somewhat entrenched in their ways, and that's both good and bad. They understand and know how to get around in Windows, so when they switch to Linux, it's really difficult. So if you do want to give somebody the thought that you should install Linux, I hope you accept the fact that it's going to include training. And when I say training, I don't mean 20 or 30 minutes after it's installed and run out the door. I mean, give them a couple 1-hour sessions at least, maybe 4 over the week or over 2 weeks. Be prepared to field calls and answer questions they have, especially if you installed the distribution of Linux that you like, because you're close to an authority, or maybe you are, and you're going to have to support them for a while. Just think about that. Think about when you started Linux and how kind of huge it is. It's like completely different. It's something almost insurmountable that you have to overcome. So those are the 5 reasons that you shouldn't switch to Linux. But let's consider if you decided you wanted to switch to Linux. Well, that's a completely different animal, isn't it? You decide you want to switch to Linux, but you still have that tether to Windows. You still have the safety to Windows that you want. There's a couple of things you could do. I recommend trying it before you buy it. So don't just wipe Windows and put Linux on it. The first thing you should do is download an ISO and create a bootable USB. If you're not able to do that, I assure you, you're not ready for Linux. So don't jump into it and say, well, I was able to create this USB bootable drive and it took 2 weeks and it was really difficult, or I had somebody do it for me, and then I put it in my USB drive. If you cannot create your own, then I don't recommend jumping to Linux. So if you can create the USB drive, or somebody does it for you, have a look, boot up into Linux, check it out, look at the applications, look at the changes, how things are different. Ask yourself, can I really accept this workflow? What applications do I really like that have to be replaced with a Linux application? And will it be difficult to get used to the workflow? The other thing you could do, if you really, really want to go with Linux, don't blow away Windows. Most of the Linux installers will let you shrink the partition, the NTFS partition that Windows resides on. So your hard drive may be, say, 1 terabyte. But in reality, Windows isn't using all that space, so the Linux installer can shrink it down a little bit, make a little bit of free room on your hard drive, and then you can install Linux there and you can dual boot. So you get to experience Linux and try different things. And if you really hit a wall with an application and you can't do what you want, no problem. Shut down, boot up Windows. Do what you need to do, and then you can go back and experiment with Linux all you want. That's my suggestion, is a dual boot. Many people do not like the dual boot because they've had problems before. Yes, I have had problems as well, but more often than not, I've had no problems with dual boot, so I just go ahead and use it. To be honest, the last time I booted into Windows on either one of my systems was probably maybe a year, 2 years. On my desktop, I almost never boot into Windows. So on my desktop, I think I've done it one time in the last year or two since I've had it. So the thing is, you can do it if you need to. It's not an issue because you have that backup there if you need it, especially if it has something to do with your job. So don't just assume Linux is going to replace everything and everything will be perfectly fine. That isn't the case. Case in point, there is no Zoom application that you can use for Linux. So there probably is one you could compile from source code. Kind of like pulling nails. I wouldn't recommend it. But Zoom, the new desktop tool, networking tool that you can use to connect with many people and have a meeting, has become very popular because of the recent coronavirus issues. So people stay at home, they use Zoom. There is a package installer for any of the Apple stuff, and there is a package installer for Windows 10, not Linux. Now, I haven't bothered to look into it. I just grab a different laptop. I have my second most likely laptop to use would be my MacBook Air, which I consider my basic internet browsing desktop system. When I want to get real work done, I pull out my Linux system. I have in the past gotten applications that were never designed to work under Linux working. And I'm talking about networking applications. So I won't say it's impossible. It's just not something a new or average Linux user is going to jump into with both feet. So you got the dual boot you could do. You have the USB drive. You can try it out as many times as you want. You can say, okay, I kind of like this, but I'm going to come back in a few days. You just plug in the USB drive and you're off to the races. And when I say USB drive, it can be just a little thumb drive. It really doesn't matter. I believe they have to be at least 4 gigabytes because the ISO is the same size as a DVD file, so it's around 4 gigabytes. That's the way to begin to learn. Once you've decided to switch to Linux, again, my 2 cents, create a virtual machine first of Windows that is basically your Windows desktop with your applications. Save the virtual machine to a portable hard drive. So not just a thumb drive, but a portable hard drive that's reliable, either an SSD or even a spinning hard drive would be much faster to transfer a virtual machine over to it. If you don't know what a virtual machine is, this is one of those reasons why you shouldn't leave Windows. If you do, and you want to create a virtual machine, I think you could do Linux. So you create a virtual machine, you put it on a portable hard drive, you decide you're going to wipe your system, but you've already backed it up. You have your documents backed up. You do the backup. Why do the backup when you already have the backup? You get it. You reboot your system and wipe it and put Linux on it. After you boot up, move the virtual machine to the Linux system. One thing to keep in mind is which virtual machine software are you going to use. I use VirtualBox because you can run it on Mac, you can run it on Windows, and you can run it on Linux. If you use a different virtual machine software, it may or may not work in Linux. So be careful, especially with the commercial software. Now there's many people out there already at their keyboards typing feverishly saying, what are you talking about? I got this to work. I know you did. I do too. But the average user, again, we're not talking about somebody more advanced. We're talking about the average to novice user. They're not going to be able necessarily to get a third-party application working where VirtualBox is almost assured to work in both Windows and Linux. So they can open up this virtual machine and they can say, I got to do this thing. Maybe I got to create a document or I need to use Photoshop. And I can do it in Windows. When I wrap it up, I can shut down my virtual machine. I can let it do updates. I really can do anything I want because most systems are capable of handling one virtual machine running while their main desktop runs, the desktop environment they're in, Linux or whatever. That isn't necessarily the case for something like a MacBook Air that only has 2 cores and is really a minimal processor at best. I'm referring to a MacBook Pro, a laptop that's relatively recent that has 4 cores. Should be able to do it just fine. The laptop I'm using right now is a Lenovo ThinkPad P1, and it has a Xeon processor with 6 cores. I have 2 SSDs in there for 1 terabyte each. No problem running a virtual machine. I can give it half the cores, okay, and it'll run fine. So it's all relative. If you think you're going to do that on a MacBook Air, you're just not. A desktop is best. iMac, a more modern processor, more modern laptop with 4 cores. So that's something to think about if you decide you want to go to Linux. Can you support a virtual machine? Now, it was back in 2008 that I made the switch to Linux, but as my desktop environment. But before I ever did that, I was in the process at the job that I worked at of moving servers to Linux. So initially, most of our servers were Windows. And when I say most of our servers are about 10. But as you can imagine, time goes on, there's more and more servers. So we set up virtualized servers on top of Linux servers running on the hardware. So we had a Linux server, and then we would install virtual servers on that. And eventually it became to be like 70 or 80 servers, and almost all of them were Linux. So I felt fairly confident. I didn't use the GUI very much back then, but I really felt confident that I would be okay, and I was. I installed Linux. I had a virtual machine running Windows because there were some network applications that could only run in Windows that we had, and some applications that were designed to work only with Windows. So I really found the move relatively easy. I would try to use the Linux apps whenever I could, and I used the Linux desktop almost all the time. And the Windows virtual machine I began using less and less and less and less. So one thing to consider if you do decide to do this, and you do a dual boot or you do a Windows virtual machine, when you're thrust into it, the growing pains may be more difficult, but the payoff usually comes faster. So the ability to understand and use Linux comes much faster when you make it a necessity. So if something doesn't work right, you have to figure it out, kind of like Windows. So your work experience or your experience with Linux becomes more about Linux because you're using it all the time. Something to think about. All right. So we've talked about the top 5 reasons not to switch to Linux, and we've talked about some ways that if you do decide to switch to Linux, you can do it, and you don't have to give up Windows necessarily. Hope this video was helpful. If it was, like and subscribe. If it was really helpful, hit my Patreon page. Link will be appearing here on the screen shortly, and maybe give me $1 for coffee. Thanks a lot. This video was made possible with support from viewers like you. If you find this video useful, consider becoming a patron for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/fastgadgets.